Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing headaches. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing tension type headaches, also simply called tension headaches or stress headaches. And we've discussed that this is the most common type of headache. Most people, when they suffer from a headache, this is the type they're suffering from. This is the type that is triggered by an emotionally stressful event in your life, or by having some sort of inflammation going on somewhere in the body. And of course the common causes of inflammation in portions of the body are getting these common infections, a cold or the flu, which are respiratory system infections, or some sort of tummy bug. And remember, this type of headache, it is bilaterally symmetric. It's not particularly severe. It's mild to moderate, the severity, and it feels like squeezing, and it's usually in the temporal region, so it feels as though your head is being squeezed from the sides. However, if it goes into the forehead and the occipital region as well, then it can feel like there is a band all the way around your head, which is squeezing in. So, as I say, this is the main type of headache, and most people in any given year will suffer from at least one of these. So what we now want to discuss is what is the pathophysiology underlying these types of headaches? How can these triggers here, emotional stress or fasting or sleep deprivation or inflammation going on in some far off place in the body, how can these all trigger this type of headache where we get this sensation here? Okay, so let's try and answer this then now. So, the first thing to ask is, where is the pain actually coming from? Is the pain coming from inside the skull or outside the skull? Are the pain neurons that are being activated inside the skull or outside the skull? They're actual nociceptors, the bit of them that is actually receptive to noxious stimuli. And at present, we believe that those pain neurons are being activated outside the skull. In particular, we think that the pain is coming from muscle tissue of the head outside the skull, rather than originating from inside the skull. Whereas, again, I keep contrasting tension type headaches to migraine headaches. In migraine headaches, we think the pain is coming from inside the skull, from the meninges that line the brain. Okay, so let's just clear up a little bit of terminology at this point. So we need to be well aware of what a nociceptor is, what a primary nociceptive afferent is. These are two terms that we need to know well. So let me start by going over what a primary nociceptive afferent is. So let me start by writing its long name down here. So primary nociceptive afferent. So this is a special name for a type of nerve cell, and it's the fancy name for a pain neuron, what I have just been calling a pain neuron. That specifically, or more correctly, is called a primary nociceptive afferent. So let's just examine this name here. Primary means that it's going to be the first neuron along in the conduction pathway of the information up to the cortex, the cerebral cortex. So it's the first neuron to detect a noxious stimulus, which is a painful stimulus, and to respond to that. Nociceptive means that it's going to respond to noxious stimuli, it's going to respond to painful stimuli, and afferent refers to the fact that it is going to deliver its information into the central nervous system rather than taking information out of the central nervous system, unlike an efferent neuron. Now, primary nociceptive afferents, they're a specific type of neuron, and that type of neuron that they're equal to is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So this describes the structure of these primary nociceptive afferents. Now, when you draw the classical neuron, when you learned back in school the structure of a neuron, you will have learned about having the cell body with lots of dendrites coming off it and then one long axon. That's the classical picture of a neuron. That is not what all neurons look like. That is what motor neurons look like. They are the classic example of that classic type of neuron. And that type of neuron is called a multipolar neuron. It has lots of different processes, more than one or two processes coming off its cell body, because it has lots of those dendrites and then one axon, so it has lots of processes overall because the dendrites and the axons count as processes. So it's a multipolar neuron. A unipolar neuron, in contrast, is one which has only one process coming off its cell body. So let me show this here. So here is the cell body with the nucleus inside. If you have just one process coming off the cell body, like so, that's what this line is representing, that is called a unipolar neuron. Now, we do not want a unipolar neuron, we are talking about pseudo-unipolar neurons. What does this mean? Pseudo-unipolar neurons are when this process that comes off the cell body splits then very quickly into two separate processes, like so. So, pseudo-unipolar neurons, this is the complete picture of a pseudo-unipolar neuron. They are effectively equivalent to bipolar neurons, which have just two processes coming off the cell body, except that they don't come directly off the cell body. Instead, you have one process coming directly off the cell body, which means that, strictly speaking, it is unipolar, but then it divides into two, so really it's equivalent to a bipolar neuron, even though we can't call it a bipolar neuron, so we call it a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So, this is what these primary nociceptive afferents are going to look like, these pain-carrying neurons are going to look like. They are pseudo-unipolar. Here is the cell body with a single process coming off, and it splits into two processes. Now, these two processes are going to have separate names and separate functions. So, let me get another colour, we'll go for some vivid green. So, one of these processes is going to go and enter the muscle tissue that it's going to innervate, or indeed the tissue that it's going to innervate. Primary nociceptive afferents don't just innervate muscle tissue. Of course, I'm interested in the ones innervating the muscle tissue of the face because I've just told you that we believe that's where the pain in tension type headaches originates from. So, let's say that this one over here is going to be the peripheral process. So this is going to go and innervate some peripheral tissue, and of course we're specifically interested in ones going and innervating muscle tissue of the head region. But this is the peripheral process which is going to go and innervate peripheral tissue, whereas the other process is going to be the central process. So this one over here, this can be the central process, and this is going to carry the information into the central nervous system. Now, if we're talking about primary nociceptive afferents, on the end of the peripheral process, you are going to have a specific sensory receptor that's going to detect noxious stimuli. Now, I should say, we have other types of sensory afferents, other than just pain afferents. We have other sensory afferents, and they are also of this form, pseudo-unipolar neurons. So, for instance, other forms of sensation are crude touch, fine touch, vibration sensation, proprioceptive sensation, high temperature sensation, low temperature sensation, all of these other types of sensation, they're carried by sensory neurons, and those sensory afferents, primary sensory afferents, we would have to replace the nociceptive with just sensory there, they will also be pseudo-unipolar, so they'll look just like this, with a peripheral process innervating the peripheral tissue from which they're getting the sensory information, and a central process delivering the information into the central nervous system. What sets the primary nociceptive afferents apart is that on the end of the peripheral process, they will have a specific sensory device, a specific structure on the end here that's going to detect noxious stimuli. So let me just show this now, and this is what is referred to as a nociceptor. So I'll try and do this. So let's just extend the peripheral process a little bit. So let's imagine that it's gone into the peripheral tissue, which is down here, and now I'm drawing the nociceptor, and we'll have it in red here. So the nociceptor looks like a tree structure. So it's just like the axon that we had here, but it's splitting now into this tree-like structure. So I'll just give it a few more branches. So here's another one. Here's another one. I'll try and connect that one up a little bit better. Okay, so this structure that we've got on the end of the peripheral process of our primary nociceptive afferent, this is the structure that's actually going to detect noxious stimuli, and therefore this is referred to as the nociceptor. Now this is important because people often get confused and refer to the entire neuron as the nociceptor, whereas really the entire neuron is the primary nociceptive afferent, whereas the nociceptor is just this structure on the end of the primary nociceptive afferent that actually detects the noxious stimuli. So I'll just put this here. Here's an arrow. It's going to be exposed to noxious stimuli, and these are going to be trying to stimulate an action potential to fire. So, the way that these things work is that in the membrane of this nociceptor portion, we will have loads of little receptors, loads of little proteins, transmembrane proteins, that can detect noxious stimuli. Now, what examples of noxious stimuli can we come up with? Well, of course, pressing too hard pressure. Now, I'll actually just write a few of these down. So let's get another colour, go back to that nice yellow colour. Okay, so examples of noxious stimuli, painful stimuli, what can we come up with? Too hard, I'll put, which is for too much pressure. So too hard is a noxious stimuli. Other noxious stimuli are too hot. So if the temperature of the tissue is too high, that's a noxious stimuli that can cause a lot of damage to tissue. And this is what all of these painful stimuli, all of these noxious stimuli are all about. They're stimuli that can cause damage to the tissue, and that's what is going to create the painful, well, that's what needs to be recognised by the nervous system and give rise to a painful experience, so that we then avoid whatever it was that gave rise to that noxious stimulus, for instance, touching something that's too hot. Or too cold, of course, is a noxious stimulus as well. Other noxious stimuli, too acidic. If the pH in the tissue goes too low, too acidic, that will of course be a noxious stimuli that can cause damage to the tissue as well. So acidic is another form of noxious stimulus. And then another type of noxious stimulus, the final one that I think I can come up with here, is inflammatory markers. So again, when you've got a region that is inflamed and you're bringing in the proteins from the bloodstream and the white blood cells from the bloodstream, and there's loads and loads of special proteins in the tissue fluid of the place that is inflamed that are actually causing this inflammatory response, some of which will go into the blood and cause the tension type headache, as we'll discuss later on. But the important thing to understand is that where you've got inflammation, you're going to have loads of inflammatory mediators there, and some of those can cause pain. So I'll put this here as well. Inflammation occurring somewhere. There are loads of mediators of inflammation which can activate nociceptors. So inflammation can also count as a noxious stimulus. And really, of course, this is occurring, hopefully, because there is a pathogen present in the tissue. So the pathogen leads to inflammation, and the inflammation is then the noxious stimulus that activates the nociceptor. Now, so in the membrane of the nociceptor, there's going to have to be loads of special receptors that can respond to these stimuli, and those are known as nociceptors. So this is another piece of terminology. The nociceptors is the name for the actual proteins in the membrane of the nociceptor which can respond to these stimuli, and the different stimuli will have different nociceptors. So for instance, there'll be some sort of receptor that can detect too acidic conditions, and when it finds too acidic conditions, it will do something that depolarizes the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane. Now, in the nociceptor, you can't actually activate an action potential because there aren't the correct voltage-gated ion channels to activate an action potential. So the action potential has to start here at the beginning of this peripheral process of the primary nociceptive afferent. So if the stimulation of the nociceptor by the noxious stimuli is great enough to create a big enough depolarization at this border here, then what will happen is the primary nociceptive afferent will fire an action potential. So I'll just put AP here for action potential. So let's just repeat that again. So Primary nociceptive afferent is the name for the pain neuron with a nociceptor on its end. Inside the nociceptor, we have loads of nocisensors in the cell membrane of that which detect the noxious stimuli. In response to the noxious stimuli, they're going to do something that is going to result in depolarization of the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane. Those depolarizations that you're going to get all over this nociceptor, because they'll be occurring everywhere if there's a noxious stimulus present, because there is going to be more than one nocisensor in the nociceptor detecting each of these types of noxious stimuli. So you'll get depolarizations occurring all over the nociceptor. They will sum together over here, and if they're great enough, if the summation of them is great enough, then an action potential will fire along the peripheral process of our primary nociceptive afferent. It will then go up and it will go along the sensory process. The central process, it will go along the central process. The central process will enter the central nervous system and will then synapse on a second order neuron. So, these are primary nociceptive afferents which detect pain. So, tension type headaches then are going, we believe, to be caused by the activation of these primary nociceptive afferents that innervate muscle tissue in the head region. So muscle tissue is innervated by primary nociceptive afferents. The muscle tissue of the head region is innervated by primary nociceptive afferents, and we believe that it's activation of those nociceptors there that is going to actually give rise to this headache. So let's just now talk about some of the muscles of the head region of the body that could be the sites where this pain is actually being generated in tension type headaches. So there's only 3 muscles that I want to talk about. The ones in the temporal regions, which are the temporalis muscles, the ones in the frontal regions, which are the frontalis muscles, and the ones in the occipital regions, which are the occipitalis muscles. Because of course that's where the pain is, so we should be looking at those muscles. So here we go then. I'm going to draw a little bit of anatomy now of the head and neck. So, you're going to have to bear with me whilst I draw some pictures of the skull. So I'm going to get a thicker pen for this, and I think it would be relevant to do the skull in white. So I'm going to draw 2 pictures of the skull to put on these muscles to make sure that everyone's familiar with where these muscles are. I'm going to draw one picture where we're looking at the skull from the front, then I'm going to draw another picture where we're looking at the skull from the side. And hopefully you will have studied anatomy at some point and will be familiar with the different parts of the skull that I'm going to draw here. So, excuse the bad art here. So, let's start from the front then. So, here we go. This is, of course, the forehead up here. Come down like so. Right, so next what I want to put on is the zygomatic arches, and the way I've been taught to draw this is like this. Okay, and I've managed to put a dot there that I'm going to get rid of. There we go. Okay, so those are the zygomatic arches. Now let's complete up the rest of the maxillary bones. So we'll come down here and along here as well. And now we want to put in the teeth. So we'll go down like so and up like this. And I'll just put in the teeth here so that hopefully you know where we are now. So these are the teeth. And okay, yes, that I've not drawn the teeth brilliantly, but you're getting the picture, hopefully. Now let's put in the mandible. So this starts within the zygomatic arch, like so. And I'll put it in on the other side as well. And then it'll come round like this and join up. And then I'll put its other border in here. Okay, so again, excuse the bad art here. It's a picture. Will illustrate it what I need it to illustrate. It will serve its purpose. So again, here are the inferior row of teeth, not drawn particularly well. I'm not a dentist. Okay, so what other things do we need to add into this picture? We need to put the orbits in, the orbital cavities. Those will, I think, make the picture a little bit more realistic. So let's put those in. They are in these positions here. So there is the right orbit, and here is the left orbit. And I'll just try and connect that up a little bit better. And then we want to put in the entrance to the nasal cavity as well. So remember, most of the nose is not bone, and therefore I'm not going to draw that in. I'm just going to draw the bony structures in. So we'll have the nasal bones in, but we won't have all the cartilage that actually sticks out the front. So let's put in the opening to the nasal cavity, and then there is the nasal septum here. So we've got the nasal bones here, and then the entrances to the nasal cavities here. So this is my very basic picture of a skull. So we can put in one of these muscles straight away on here. We can put in the frontalis muscles. So let's do that. So I'll get my red pen for this. So we're going to now put in the frontalis muscle, which is one of the muscles which probably the pain can originate in tension type headaches when the pain goes all the way around. So remember, in tension type headaches, the pain is often just bilaterally in the temporal regions, but it can go all the way around. It can go into the frontal region and the occipital region. When it goes into the frontal region, it's probably this muscle that it's originating from, the frontalis muscle. And so you have a frontalis muscle on both sides. You have a right frontalis muscle and a left frontalis muscle, and they are a sort of quadrilateral shape, like so. So here is the right frontalis muscle, and here is the left frontalis muscle as well, in these positions. So they're a nice sort of simple square of muscle here. Now, they do not attach to bone, and I hope it should be obvious why they do not attach to bone. If this attached to the bone here and this attached to the bone here, when this thing contracts, what will happen is it will pull this way, the top will pull downwards, and the bottom will pull upwards. Is that going to work well? No, because then it's going to be pulling on things that are not movable. It will be pulling on the bone here and pulling on the bone here, and it's not going to win. It won't end up contracting because the bone will win. It's stronger than this muscle. So the frontalis muscles are not attached to bone. Instead, they are attached to the superficial fascia underneath the skin. They're attached to connective tissue that's just underneath the skin. So you have the skin on top. Underneath you'll have connective tissue, the superficial fascia, and then underneath that you'll have the muscle, and the muscle is attached to the superficial fascia. Now what does that mean? When these contract, what are they going to do? They're going to pull the skin. So you'll pull the skin up here downwards and the skin here upwards. So this is how you crinkle your forehead. You pull your eyebrows up and you crinkle your forehead because you're pulling the skin from the top downwards and from the bottom upwards. So that's what the frontalis muscles are and where they are and what they do. The next muscles we want to show are the temporalis muscle and the occipitalis muscle. So let's do the temporalis muscle next. So this requires us to now draw the skull from the side. So this is an even more difficult picture for me to draw. So let me just get a little bit more space. So there's the skull from the front. Now let's do the skull from the side. So we will do it from the left-hand side. So we'll imagine I'm standing over here, looking at the skull from the left-hand side, and what would I see? So again, I apologise for this picture. So here is the forehead region again, and here is the skull going all the way backwards, the occipital region at the back here, and I'll stop there until I've drawn a bit more at the front. Now let's do the nasal bone coming forward. So here is the nasal bone, the only portion of the bit of the nose that actually sticks out that is bone. Then we'll have the rest of the nasal septum coming backwards like this, or the maxillary bone rather. You can't actually see the nasal septum. This is the maxillary bone here, coming back like this. The entrance to the nasal cavity would be here. This is the equivalent of this bit. This bit is this bit here. Okay, we'll put on the orbital cavities that we can just about see from this sort of angle. So here is the orbital cavity, the left orbit of course, there. Then what we need to put on is the zygomatic arch. So here we go. This part of course is this bit here, the zygomatic bone. So this is the maxillary bone. It then joins with the zygomatic bone here. And there's then this arch which gives rise to a little tunnel. You know, if I could stand here, I could go through this tunnel. And this is the infratemporal fossa, this hole here. And that piece of bone that is the cheekbones is the zygomatic arch that's formed from the process from the zygomatic bone, this bone here, and also a process coming forward from the temporal bone, which we'll see, and it's in this sort of position here. So let's just put that on now. So here is the zygomatic arch going off like that. I'll try and put in a little bit of the mastoid process. There's the mastoid process. Here's the rest of the zygomatic arch coming forward like that. And now let's continue on down with the maxilla here. Okay, and let's try and put in the mandible now. So, the mandible, remember, this is the body of the mandible here. These bits of the mandible that stick up to articulate with the base of the skull here, those are called the rami of the mandible. So this is the left ramus of the mandible, this is the right ramus of the mandible, and the ramus of the mandible then splits into two at the top. The head of the mandible, which will articulate here, and that's called the temporomandibular joint, because it's between the temporal bone here and the mandible, and then there'll be the coronoid process of the mandible, which sticks through the zygomatic arch here. So let's just try and put this in. So here is the head of the mandible, and then here is the coronoid process, and then the ramus of the mandible going down like so, and then here is the body of the mandible. And I'll complete that up there, and then let's put in the teeth. So let's continue the body downwards like so, and then we'll put in teeth. So this can be both rows of teeth. So there's the superior and inferior rows of teeth there. Now, have I missed anything that I'd like to put on this picture? I don't think so. That's my picture of the skull from the side. And so let's just label a few things up here. This area here, there is a sort of hole here, a cavity here that's we like to call a fossa, and this is the temporal fossa. In between the zygomatic arch, there's another fossa here, and that's called the infratemporal fossa. Now, the next muscle that I am interested in is, of course, the temporalis muscle, which is a muscle of mastication, which means to chew. A muscle of mastication. It sounds dodgy, but it's not. It's a muscle that we use to chew. And this is the temporalis muscle. And this has its body in the temporal fossa. In fact, if you feel that portion of your head, you can feel a sort of squodgy thing but there, and that's the temporalis muscle. And if you bite, you can hopefully feel that contracting. Okay, so let me draw it in here. It's in this sort of position, so all in red here. And of course it's on both sides. You have two temporalis muscles, a left one, which is the one we're drawing here, and a right one. So this is the temporalis muscle, and its tendon will extend downwards through the infratemporal fossa, and I would just like to put a few names on here. So the temporalis muscle is in the temporal fossa, which is this cavity here. It's not the name for this cavity behind the zygomatic arch. This structure here is the zygomatic arch, made up of the process from the zygomatic bone, which is here, and a process from the temporal bone, which is here. So I'll just put that on here. So we have the zygomatic arch there, and then that cavity behind the zygomatic arch, where the coronoid process of the mandible is sticking up into here. If I was a little man standing here, I could go behind the zygomatic arch and come out down here. That cavity there is called the infratemporal fossa, and that is where the tendon of the temporalis muscle is going to run to connect to the coronoid process of the mandible. So the infratemporal fossa. And I've just realised I've been writing in the thicker pen, but I quite like it in the thicker pen. I might stick to this thicker pen. So, putting on the tendon now, the muscle extends downwards here, the fibres extend down, and then it will turn into tendon, and it will connect to this coronoid process of the mandible, and that's another piece of terminology I should put on, so that you know how to spell it. The coronoid process of the mandible. That's that process from the ramus of the mandible, and I'll put that down as well. This is the ramus of the mandible. And the mandible is just the jawbone. This is the head of the mandible here that is actually the one that makes the joint by which we can open and close our mouth. This is the coronoid process of the mandible, which extends up into the infratemporal fossa, and the temporalis muscle tendon joins onto there. When the temporalis muscle contracts, it will pull this upwards and therefore will swing the jaw upwards. So when the jaw opens, if we want to close it again, the temporalis muscle is the muscle to is one of the muscles to contract. And therefore, when we chew, which of course involves us moving our jaw, swinging our jaw open and closed, we use this muscle, and therefore we describe it as a muscle of mastication. And mastication means chewing, so it's a muscle of mastication. Okay, so you have two temporalis muscles again, a right temporalis muscle and a left temporalis muscle. So these are those massive muscles that are in these positions on the sides of the head, the temporal regions of the head. Tension-type headaches usually occur in those regions. We think they arise in muscles. Which muscle do we therefore think that they arise in? Probably the temporalis muscle. So a very important muscle for us to know about. Let's finally, I said I was only going to draw the skull from two aspects. Let's draw the skull from one final aspect, which is the posterior aspect. So I'm now going to draw it from the back, and of course this is incredibly easy. I'm just going to draw a box, effectively. I'm going to draw this bit. I won't bother trying to draw what we'd see of the mandible if we looked from that angle. And I'm doing this so that we can see occipitalis, a big muscle, a muscle in the occipital region of the head, which could be where the pain, if the tension-type headache extends into the occipital region, is originating from. So let's put this here. So this is the back of the skull that we're seeing now here. Okay, and now let's put the occipitalis muscles on. And again, I'll do these in red, so occipitalis. So again, these are simple shaped muscles, similar to the frontalis. I'll draw them nicely as squares, and they're at the back of the head in the occipital region here. And again, you have two of them. You have a right occipitalis, which is not the one I've just drawn. I've just drawn the left occipitalis. Here's the right occipitalis. So again, I'm imagining this is the right-hand side, this is the left-hand side. So this is the left occipitalis, this is right occipitalis. I'll just colour them in. So what do these muscles attach to? They don't attach to bone. Again, there would be a problem if they attached to bone. The same problem that we have with the frontalis muscles if they attach to bone, which is that they're trying to move something that's unmovable. The temporalis muscle attached to bone, but then it was attached to the bone of the temporal fossa and the bone of the coronoid process, and those were actually movable. There was a movable joint here. Whereas if this attached to bone, it would be attaching to things that are not movable, so it wouldn't be able to contract. Instead, again, it's attached to the superficial fascias, and therefore what it can do is it can move the superficial tissues, the skin. So it will move the skin here downwards, and it will move the skin at the bottom here upwards. So these are the important muscles of the face that I want you to know about as far as the pathophysiology of tension-type headaches is concerned. The two frontalis muscles in the forehead, the two temporalis muscles in the temporal regions, and the two occipitalis muscles at the occipital regions of the head, the back of the head. These are all going to have primary nociceptive afferents innervating them with their nociceptors inside the muscle tissue, and we believe that it is the activation of these nociceptors in these muscle tissues and then the consequent activation of the primary nociceptive afferents that gives rise to a tension-type headache. So, the next thing that we need to discuss in the pathogenesis of tension-type headaches is where do the central processes of these primary nociceptive afferents that innervate these muscles of the head and neck region actually go. Now, they go into something called the trigeminal cervical complex. And we're going to have a break here, but in the next video we will be discussing a lot about this complex. We'll be doing some background anatomy. So the trigeminal cervical complex, and in principle it should all be one word, but I have run out of space. So trigeminal cervical complex, which for short is called the TCC. So that's where the central processes of these primary nociceptive afferents that innervate these muscle tissues of the head and neck are going to all go, and we'll discuss the anatomy of how they actually get into this, where it is, and how they actually get into this. So this will involve going over the trigeminal nerve anatomy and also some anatomy of the mixed spinal nerves of the cervical region. So we'll do that in the next video.